High in the mountains, where the air was thin and clean, and the mornings always began with mist curling around the rooftops like soft breath, there was a village that time seemed to forget. It wasn't on most maps, and if you weren't looking for it, you'd never find it. The people there didn't need much, just good soil, clean water, and each other. They grew their own food, fixed their own roofs, and knew every bend in the river by heart. Children played barefoot in the dirt. Elders told stories under the old oak tree, and no one locked their doors at night. Life moved slowly, but it moved with purpose. Then one day everything changed. A black SUV rolled into the village, not the kind of car anyone owned there. It kicked up dust as it crawled down the narrow dirt road, past vegetable patches and chicken coops until it stopped right in the center of the square. Out stepped three men in stiff suits, holding clipboards and wearing expressions that said they'd rather be anywhere else. Behind them came a local official, sweating despite the cool mountain air, clearly nervous. They called a meeting right there, under the sky. Everyone came. Farmers with dirt under their nails, mothers with babies on their hips, teenagers leaning against fence posts. No one spoke. They just waited. The man in the lead cleared his throat. He didn't look anyone in the eye. He read from a paper, voice flat, like he was announcing bus schedules, not the end of a way of life. The government, he said, had discovered something valuable beneath the village. Lithium. A metal needed for batteries, for electric cars, for the future. And because of that, the land now belonged to the state. Every home, every field, every well would be taken. They had 30 days to leave. Compensation? A small sum. Barely enough to rent a room in the city for a few months. When someone asked what would happen to the graves of their ancestors buried behind the old chapel, the man just shrugged and said, "That's not covered in the agreement." The villagers didn't shout. They didn't throw stones or block the road, but you could feel the silence thicken, like cold settling into your bones. One woman turned and walked away without a word. Others just stared at their shoes. The official from town tried to smile to soften the blow, but his eyes kept darting toward the SUV like he couldn't wait to get back to his real life. Later that evening, the whole village gathered again, but this time not in the square. They met in the barn where the smell of hay and wood smoke filled the air. No one needed to say much. They all knew what this meant. This wasn't just about land, it was about memory. About the way Grandma used to hang herbs to dry by the window. About the path kids took to school, worn smooth by generations of small feet. About the spring where couples whispered promises under starlight. All of it, gone. An elder, a woman with silver hair and hands rough from decades of work, stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She just said, "They think we're nothing because we don't wear suits or speak in big words. But we know this place like we know our own heartbeat. And if they want it, they'll have to take it from empty houses." No one argued. No one cried, not yet. There was a quiet understanding in the room, like a shared breath. They wouldn't beg. They wouldn't riot. They would leave, but not the way the council expected. Over the next few days, something strange happened. Instead of packing in panic, the villagers moved with calm purpose. They harvested what they could from the gardens, beans, potatoes, squash, and dried or canned them. They carefully wrapped family photos, carved wooden toys, and hand-stitched quilts. They filled jars with seeds, not just for food, but for memory. Every item chosen had meaning. Nothing was wasted. At night, you could see lights in windows long after dark. Not from anger or fear, but from love. Parents showing children how to fold a blanket the way their grandparents did. Neighbors helping each other take down shutters, not to destroy, but to preserve. There was no music, no laughter, but there was dignity. A deep, quiet dignity that filled the air like incense. Meanwhile, the council sent inspectors to check on progress. They expected chaos, people crying, refusing to leave, maybe even chaining themselves to trees. Instead, they found neat yards, swept porches, and doors left slightly ajar, as if the owners might return any minute. One inspector walked into a kitchen and found a pot of stew still warm on the stove, bread wrapped in cloth on the table, and a single cup beside it. It felt less like abandonment and more like a message. We were here. We lived well, and you didn't deserve us. The inspectors reported back that the relocation was going smoothly. No resistance. No delays, the project was right on schedule. The council members smiled over their coffee, pleased with how efficiently things were moving. They didn't notice the weight in the silence, They didn't understand that sometimes the loudest protest is the one that makes no sound at all. Back in the village, the final night came. Under a sky thick with stars, stars you could only see far from city lights, the last families locked their doors for the last time. But they didn't throw away the keys. They tucked them into pockets like promises. Then one by one they walked down the mountain path carrying bundles on their backs, children in their arms, dogs at their heels. No horns honked. No engines roared. Just footsteps on dirt, the rustle of fabric, and the occasional soft sniffle quickly swallowed by the wind. By dawn, the village was empty. But it wasn't dead. It was waiting, and somewhere far below, in a polished office with glass walls and framed degrees, the men who signed the order sipped their morning coffee, unaware that their smooth operation had just planted the seed of their own regret. They thought they'd removed a problem. What they'd really done was erase people who knew how to listen to the land, and in doing so, they'd silenced the only voices that could have saved them from their own mistakes. The mountain stood quiet. The river kept flowing, and the empty houses with their open doors and lit lanterns stood like silent witnesses. Not of loss, but of what happens when you forget that people are more than just numbers on a page. The morning after they left, the village looked like it was still breathing. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, not from fires, but from the last embers slowly dying in cold hearths. A rooster crowed once, confused, then fell silent. Chickens pecked at the dirt near empty coops. A cat stretched on a windowsill, waiting for a hand that wouldn't come to feed it. Everything was exactly as it had been the day before, except for the people. They were gone. Not in a rush, not in anger, but with such quiet care that it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Down in the valley, the council's team arrived early, boots crunching on gravel they'd never walked on before. They expected chaos, maybe broken windows, angry graffiti, furniture dumped in the road. Instead, they found flower pots lined neatly on porches, tools hung on hooks in the sheds, and kitchen tables wiped clean. In one house, a child's drawing was still taped to the wall, a bright sun, a crooked house, two stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. The inspectors paused, but only for a second. Then they snapped photos for their report and moved on, calling it orderly evacuation. But the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, like walking into a room where someone just stopped crying. You could feel it in your chest. Meanwhile, the villagers weren't far. They'd walked through the night, down winding trails only they knew until they reached the edge of the lowlands. There, in an old abandoned schoolhouse someone had once used for summer camps, they gathered. It wasn't home, but it was shelter. Mattresses were laid out on the floor, shared between families. A single wood stove in the corner kept them warm. Someone had brought a pot of beans from the last harvest, and another had a sack of rice. They shared what they had without being asked. No one complained about the thin walls or the leaky roof. They'd lost everything, but not each other. In the city, life moved fast. Cars honked. People rushed past with eyes on their phones. No one noticed the group of mountain folk standing quietly at the bus stop. Their clothes worn but clean, their faces tired but calm. When they tried to find work, they were met with puzzled looks. "You don't have ID from here? No address? Where's your resume?" They didn't know how to answer. Their resume was in the soil they'd tilled, in the animals they'd raised, in the songs they'd sung to calm storms. None of that fit on paper, but they didn't beg. They took whatever work they could, washing dishes in hot kitchens, sweeping floors in warehouses, sorting recyclables at dawn. Their hands, used to shaping wood and planting seeds, now scrubbed greasy pans and lifted heavy boxes. At night, they returned to the schoolhouse, sore and silent. Sometimes someone would hum an old tune and others would join in softly, voices blending like wind through pines. Those moments were their lifeline. Back in the village, strange things began to happen. Without the villagers' careful tending, the irrigation channels clogged. Rainwater pooled where it shouldn't. Weeds crept into the vegetable patches, not wild and free, but tangled and suffocating. The council's engineers arrived with machines, big, loud things that growled and spat smoke. They started drilling near the old well, convinced the lithium was just below. But the ground was trickier than their maps showed. One machine sank axle-deep into soft earth near the riverbank, the very spot the villagers always avoided during spring thaw. The crew cursed, confused. This wasn't on the survey, one muttered. Worse, the bees stopped coming. For generations, the villagers had planted wildflowers along the edges of their fields, not just for beauty, but to feed the bees that pollinated crops miles away. Now, with no one to care for those blooms, the flowers wilted, and with them the bees vanished. Farmers in the next valley noticed their fruit trees weren't setting fruit like before. They didn't know why, but they felt the change in their harvests in their pockets. Still, the council pushed forward. They posted photos online, shiny machines, hard hats, blueprints. Progress, the caption said, a brighter future. But in the comments, questions started appearing. What happened to the people who lived there? Why does the site look so empty? Someone even uploaded a video shot from a drone, showing the neat, untouched houses, the empty clotheslines, the lone dog wandering the square. It got shared thousands of times. People called it haunting, sad, wrong. The villagers, meanwhile, kept their heads down, but they weren't invisible. A young woman working at a laundromat started talking to customers, quietly, carefully about where she came from. An old man fixing bikes at a shop told stories to kids who came by after school. Not angry stories, just true ones, about clean water that tasted like rain, about nights so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, about a place where no one went hungry because everyone shared. People listened, and they remembered. One evening, a reporter showed up at the schoolhouse. Not with a big camera crew, just a notebook and a kind face. She'd heard rumors. She asked if anyone would talk. At first, no one answered. Then slowly one person spoke, then another. They didn't shout. They didn't blame. They just described what it felt like to leave your grandmother's rocking chair behind, to walk away from the tree you were married under, to know your child would never run through those same fields barefoot. The reporter wrote it all down. And when her article came out, it didn't use fancy words. It just said they left without a sound. But their silence is screaming. The council saw it. And for the first time, they felt uneasy. Not because of protests, but because people were starting to care. Because the story wasn't about lithium anymore. It was about people. Real people. With real lives. And real loss. But the villagers weren't waiting for apologies. They were planting seeds. In window boxes and cracked buckets in any patch of dirt they could find. Tiny green shoots pushing through concrete, a quiet promise that life goes on. Even when the ground beneath you is gone and high up in the mountains the empty village stood, clean, still, and waiting. Not for machines, not for money, but for the day someone would finally understand. You can't measure a home in square feet or mineral value. You measure it in memories, in love. In the quiet way a door creaks when you open it after a long day. The council thought they'd won. But the real story was just beginning. Weeks passed and the truth began to show. Not in loud speeches or angry headlines, but in the slow, stubborn way real life works. The council's big mining project, once praised as the engine of progress, started falling apart like a house built on sand. The machines kept getting stuck. The ground, soft in places no map had shown, swallowed tires and twisted metal. Workers complained about strange rashes after drinking the local water that had always been pure when the villagers were there. No one could explain why, but the truth was simple. The villagers had known how to keep the springs clean. They'd lined the wells with certain stones, planted specific roots to filter runoff, and never dumped waste near the streams. Without them, the land began to sicken. Even the weather seemed to turn against the project. Rain came harder than usual, washing away freshly dug trenches. One night, a small landslide buried part of the access road, the same slope the villagers had always avoided building on, whispering old warnings about sleeping earth. The engineers cursed their luck, but the locals in nearby towns just shook their heads. They should have listened, one farmer muttered, watching the mudslide from his porch. Those people knew this mountain like their own skin. Meanwhile, down in the city, the displaced villagers were slowly becoming part of the fabric of everyday life. Not as victims, but as neighbors. The woman who used to weave blankets now mended clothes at a tiny shop, her fingers still quick and sure. The man who once repaired plows now fixed bicycles, always giving kids a free tune-up before school. People started recognizing them, not as those mountain folks, but as Mrs. Lin, who always had a kind word, or Mr. Tao, who remembered your dog's name. And when they spoke, quietly over tea or while waiting for the bus, people listened. A schoolteacher heard one of them describe how they used to predict rain by watching the ants. She turned it into a lesson for her students about traditional knowledge. A chef at a local restaurant started using wild herbs the villagers mentioned, things like mountain mint and sun-dried fiddleheads, and customers raved about the new flavors. Bit by bit, the story of Elderglen wasn't just a tragedy anymore. It became a reminder of something valuable that had been lost. Then came the bees, or rather, the lack of them. Farmers in 3 surrounding valleys reported their crops weren't pollinating like before. Apples stayed small. Berries didn't ripen. One orchard owner drove all the way to the city just to ask if anyone knew what happened to the wildflower strips along the mountain ridge. "We used to get swarms from up there every spring," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Now, nothing." A university student researching local ecosystems connected the dots. She published a short report showing how the disappearance of those flower borders, tended for generations by the villagers, had disrupted the entire pollination chain. Her findings went viral, not because they were dramatic, but because they made sense. People began to see it wasn't just a village that was gone. It was a whole system of care, balance, and quiet wisdom. The council tried to fix things. They hired new consultants. They promised community engagement. They even offered double the original payment to anyone from Elderglen who would come back as advisors. Flyers were printed. Phone calls were made, but no one answered. The villagers had seen how they were treated before. They knew an apology wrapped in profit wasn't real. One of them, speaking to a local radio show, put it simply, "You didn't want us when we lived there. Now you want our knowledge, but not our presence. That's not respect. That's theft with a smile." Public opinion shifted like wind through trees. Quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Social media filled with photos of the empty village, a child's shoe left by a doorstep, a rusted watering can still hanging on a fence, a single red ribbon tied to a gate, left as a farewell. People shared memories of visiting the village years ago, buying honey or being offered tea by a stranger who asked nothing in return. "They welcomed everyone," one comment read, "and we let them be thrown out like trash." Protests began, not huge, angry mobs, but steady, peaceful gatherings. Every Saturday, a small group stood outside the council's main office holding signs that said things like, "Homes are not obstacles," and "Listen to the land." They didn't shout. They just stood there, silent like the villagers had been. The media couldn't ignore it anymore. News vans showed up. Interviews were requested. And this time the story wasn't about lithium or economic growth. It was about people, about dignity, about what happens when you treat human lives as inconvenient details in a grand plan. Inside the council chambers, the mood changed. The confident smiles were gone. Meetings grew tense. Some members argued they should push forward. "We've invested too much to stop now." Others whispered about resigning before the scandal grew deeper. One official, after reading a letter from a retired teacher who'd once taught in Elderglen, quietly packed his things and left without saying goodbye. But the real turning point came from an unexpected place: the workers on the ground. The men and women operating the machines, the ones sleeping in trailers near the empty village, started asking questions. "Why are we tearing up land that clearly doesn't want us here?" One asked his foreman. Another found an old journal in an abandoned shed, pages filled with notes about planting cycles, weather patterns, even remedies for bee stings. He read it aloud during a lunch break. Soon the crew wasn't just doing a job. They were walking through a ghost story, and they didn't like the role they'd been given. One morning they refused to start the drills. Not with anger, not with threats, just a quiet, "We're not comfortable with this anymore." The foreman tried to argue, but even he couldn't look at the empty houses without feeling uneasy. Word spread fast. Other crews hesitated. Contractors backed out. The project, once unstoppable, began to stall, not because of laws or money, but because ordinary people finally saw the human cost. And through it all, the villagers stayed calm. They didn't gloat. They didn't demand revenge. They just kept living, planting herbs in cracked pots, teaching city kids how to braid grass, sharing stories that carried the weight of a whole world. They knew something the council had forgotten. You can't erase a community and expect the land to stay the same, because people in place are woven together like thread and cloth. Pull one out and the whole thing starts to unravel. The silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was full of everything they'd loved, and now the whole region was starting to hear it. The pressure didn't come like a storm. It came like rain that wouldn't stop. At first, it was just a few voices. A letter to the local paper, a short video shared by a student, a quiet conversation at a bus stop. But soon those drops turned into a steady downpour. People who'd never heard of the mountain village before now knew its name. They saw photos of empty doorways with lanterns still burning, of gardens overgrown but not forgotten, of a single swing swaying in the wind with no child on it. It wasn't just sad. It felt wrong, deep in the gut. News stations that once ignored the story now sent reporters. Not with flashy cameras and loud questions, but with notebooks and open ears. They sat with the displaced villagers in the old schoolhouse, sipping weak tea from chipped mugs, listening to stories about how the river used to sing after rain, or how elders could tell the season by the way the wind moved through the pines. These weren't just memories, they were lessons. And people were hungry for them. Then came the leaks. Someone inside the council's office. Maybe a clerk tired of pretending everything was fine. Maybe a junior staffer with a conscience. Sent documents to a journalist. The paper showed something ugly. The same men who approved the land seizure had secret investments in the mining company. They weren't just pushing progress, they were pushing their own profit. The public didn't just feel disappointed. They felt betrayed. Protests grew, but not in the way most expected. There were no burning tires or smashed windows. Instead, every weekend, hundreds of people walked quietly to the council's main building holding candles or wildflowers. Some brought seeds and planted them in cracks in the pavement. Others stood in silence for exactly 30 minutes, the same number of days the villagers had been given to leave their homes. A group of school children made paper birds and hung them from the gates, each one labeled with a word like home, respect, or remember. The message was clear. This wasn't about politics. It was about people. Faced with rising anger and shrinking support, the council tried to fix things the only way they knew how, with money and promises. They announced a new offer, triple the original payment, free housing in the city, even jobs on the revised project. They called a press conference, smiling stiffly into the cameras, saying they'd listen to community concerns. But when they reached out to the villagers, no one answered their calls. Letters came back unopened. The offer sat on a table in the schoolhouse for days, untouched. Finally, one of the elders picked it up, not with anger, but with quiet disappointment. "They still don't understand," she said. This was never about money. A few days later, she agreed to speak, not at a rally, not on a stage, but on a small local radio show that played folk songs and weather reports. Her voice was calm, steady, like water over smooth stones. She didn't accuse. She didn't shout. She simply said, "You took our land, yes. But worse, you acted like our lives didn't matter. Like our knowledge was useless. Like our love for that place was foolish, and that is what hurts the most." Listeners called in crying. Farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, all saying the same thing. "We're sorry. We should have spoken up sooner." That interview changed everything. Politicians who had stayed silent now rushed to distance themselves from the council. One by one, officials began to resign, not with grand speeches, but with short, embarrassed statements. Personal reasons, they'd say, but everyone knew the truth. Their reputations were crumbling faster than the muddy roads up in the mountains. The mining company, sensing the tide turning, quietly pulled back. Machines were shut down. Security guards packed up. The site, once buzzing with noise and diesel fumes, fell still again. This time not because people left, but because no one dared to continue. But the villagers didn't celebrate. There was no victory dance, no triumphant return. They knew their home was still gone. The fields were trampled. The well was polluted. The bees hadn't come back. What they felt wasn't joy. It was relief that the truth had finally been seen. And maybe, just maybe, a small flicker of hope. Some began visiting the village again, not to move back, but to tend. They cleared debris from the paths. They replanted wildflowers along the edges of the fields. They left fresh water out for the stray dog that still waited by the old chapel. It wasn't about reclaiming ownership. It was about honoring what had been, about showing the land it hadn't been forgotten. In the city, something else shifted. Neighbors started knocking on the schoolhouse door, not with pity, but with offers. "We have extra firewood. My aunt has a spare room. Can I help you fix that roof?" The villagers, who had kept to themselves out of pride and pain, slowly began to accept. Not because they needed saving, but because they realized they weren't alone anymore. And then came the apology, not from a press release, not from a politician trying to save face, but from a group of young people, students, artists, farmers who had never even met the villagers. They organized a gathering in the town square. No speeches, just music, shared food, and a long table covered in handwritten notes. "We see you," one read. "Thank you for teaching us what home really means," said another. At the end of the day, they walked together to the edge of the mountain road and released paper lanterns into the dusk, each one carrying a promise to protect, to listen, to remember. The council watched it all from their offices, now half empty, their power fading like old paint. They had thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. The villagers' quiet departure had done what shouting never could. It made people stop, look, and finally care, and in that caring, the real healing began, not just for the land, but for everyone who had forgotten how to listen. Months passed, and the mountain village didn't come back to life the way it once was, but it didn't stay dead either. It became something new, a place of memory, of quiet teaching, of slow healing. The mining machines were gone, hauled away like bad dreams. The holes in the earth were filled in, not by engineers, but by hands that knew the soil, hands that had once planted beans and carrots in that very ground. Wildflowers returned first, tiny and brave, pushing through cracked earth. Then came the bees, drawn by the scent of blossoms they hadn't smelled in a long time. The river, once muddy from careless digging, began to run clear again. The villagers didn't all move back. Some had found roots in the city, new jobs, new friends, children in new schools. But they came often, walking the old paths like pilgrims. They didn't rebuild every house. Instead, they turned some into small gathering spaces, places where school groups could learn about native plants, where young farmers could study how to grow food without poisoning the land, where elders could sit and tell stories under the same oak tree that had shaded generations before them. What surprised everyone was how many people wanted to listen. Not just locals, but visitors from far away, teachers, students, even city planners who came not to take but to learn. They brought notebooks, not bulldozers. They asked questions like, "How did you know when to plant?" Or "Why did you leave that patch of forest untouched?" And the villagers answered not as victims but as keepers of something precious, knowledge that couldn't be downloaded, only lived. The council, now a shadow of what it once was, issued a formal apology. It was printed in newspapers and read aloud at a town meeting. But the villagers didn't cheer. They simply accepted it, not as a victory but as a beginning. An apology means nothing if it doesn't change how you act next time, one of them said gently. And so they asked for something more than words, a promise that no community would ever be removed without their true consent again. Not just a signature on a paper, but real listening, real respect. To everyone's surprise, the new leadership agreed. New rules were written, slowly, carefully, with input from farmers, elders, even children. Back in the city, the old schoolhouse where the villagers had sheltered became a community center. The same room where they'd shared beans and silence now held cooking classes using mountain herbs, weaving workshops, and storytelling nights. City kids learned how to identify edible plants. Retired workers taught how to mend clothes instead of throwing them away. It wasn't about going back to the past, it was about bringing the best of that quiet, caring way of life into the present. And the land? It healed, but not quickly. Healing never is. Some scars remained. The flattened spot where a home once stood, the bent fence post, the well that would never hold clean water again. But those scars became part of the story. School groups would visit and hear not just about what was lost, but about what was learned. This is where they left, a guide might say. But this is also where we began to see each other clearly. The most powerful thing wasn't a building or a policy. It was the shift in how people saw one another. Before, the villagers had been invisible, just those people in the hills. Now they were neighbors, teachers, friends. And the city folks? They weren't just strangers with loud cars and bright lights. They were people willing to learn, to change, to show up with shovels and seeds instead of surveys and contracts. One spring morning, years later, a group of children, some from the mountain, some from the city, planted a new orchard on the edge of the old village. They dug holes with small hands, placed saplings in the earth, and watered them with buckets carried from the cleanest part of the stream. An elder watched from a bench nearby, smiling not because everything was fixed, but because the next generation was learning to care before it was too late. No one talked about the council much anymore. Their names faded from headlines. Their offices shrank. But their mistake lived on, not as a warning of punishment, but as a lesson in humility. Because what they'd failed to understand was simple. You can't measure a home in dollars or minerals. A home is made of shared meals, of knowing your neighbor's cough in the dark, of trusting the land because you've lived with it your whole life. And when you erase that quietly, without even looking someone in the eye, the silence you leave behind speaks louder than any protest ever could. Today, if you walk through the village at dusk, you'll see lights, not from electricity, but from oil lanterns placed on doorsteps, not because anyone lives there full time, but because someone comes every evening to light them. It's a ritual now, a way of saying, we remember, we're still here, and we won't let this happen again. Tourists sometimes stop, take photos, and ask what the lanterns mean. The answer is always the same. They're for the ones who left in silence and for the ones who finally learned to listen. The mountain stands as it always has, old, patient, watching. And down below in towns and cities and quiet corners, people carry the story forward, not with anger, but with care. Because the real victory wasn't getting the land back. It was waking up a whole society to the truth that no progress is real if it tramples people on the way. And in that quiet truth, the regret of the council became something useful, not just shame, but a seed. A seed that grew into respect, into change, into a promise whispered not in boardrooms but in gardens, classrooms, and around kitchen tables. Never again will we treat a home like it's nothing.